When you read through Jesus' genealogy in the Bible, you see all these famous names kings, prophets, and shepherds. But what about princes who were born in exile? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers of history and find out the real story of two super important, but also kind of mysterious figures in that family tree Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. Right, we see their names listed, but who were they? I mean, what was it actually like to be a Davidic prince, but have no kingdom, to be born under a totally foreign empire? So let's do this. Let's treat this like a real historical investigation and see what we can uncover. Okay, so every good investigation has to start with the most basic question. Where are we even talking about? Before we can get into their lives, we have to pin down the location based on, actual hard evidence. So, right off the bat, we need to clear something up. A lot of people hear Babylon and think of Persia, which is modern-day Iran. But that's not quite right. The real, historical, archaeological consensus is super clear. Ancient Babylon was in Mesopotamia. Today, that's modern Iraq. And that's the real-world stage for our whole story. Okay, so how do we know this for sure? Well, we've got proof. Meet the absolute star of our archaeological evidence, the Babylonian ration tablets. These are real cuneiform tablets dug up right there in Babylon, and they date all the way back to around 592 BCE. So what's on them? They're basically administrative records, like ancient spreadsheets, and they list out food and oil rations being given to, get this, King Jehoiachin, who was Shealtiel's father, and his sons. This is an incredible physical piece of evidence that lines up perfectly with the biblical accounts in 2 Kings and Jeremiah. And here is the absolute key takeaway from this. The very existence of these tablets just shatters that common image we have of the Judean royals being in chains, working as slaves. This proves they were actually being maintained by the Babylonian state. Now, don't get me wrong, they were definitely captives, but their status was way more complicated than just simple slavery. So if they weren't slaves, then what were they? This physical evidence really helps us build a much clearer picture of what their day-to-day life was actually like. So let's dig into what it truly meant to be part of the Judean royal family living in Babylon. The term historians use is imperial subject. And as you can see, this was a pretty complex legal spot to be in. They were not chattel slaves. That's a really important distinction. They were registered residents, which means they had a recognized legal identity, and that allowed them to live relatively normal lives. They could get married, have kids, even pass down an inheritance. We actually have other evidence, like the Al-Yahudu tablets, that showed Judean exiles leasing land and signing contracts. Of course, it wasn't total freedom. It came with big obligations, like paying taxes and providing service to the empire. This brings us to another really important idea, the dethroned household. Think about it. Shealtiel himself wasn't dethroned. He was never on the throne in the first place. It was his father, Jehoiachin, who lost the kingdom. So Shealtiel was born into a family that was still royal in name and in lineage, but had absolutely zero political power. It was their dynasty status, not something that happened to him personally. All right, now it's time for a classic biblical puzzle. As we start digging into the actual family tree, the Bible seems to have a bit of a contradiction about who exactly Zerubbabel's father was. So let's see if we can solve it. Okay, here's the problem laid out side by side. In most places, including Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, Zerubbabel is called the son of Shealtiel. But there's this one specific passage in 1 Chronicles that says his father was a guy named Pedaiah, who was actually Shealtiel's brother. So which one is it? Is the Bible just contradicting itself here? Well, the solution is all about understanding the ancient context. The Hebrew word for son is ben. And back then, ben didn't always mean your direct biological child. It was often used to mean legal heir or the official successor in a family line. So this means Zerubbabel was Shealtiel's legal son and heir to the royal line, even if he might have been the biological son of his uncle, Pedaiah. These genealogies weren't trying to trace DNA, They were tracing the official, legal, royal line of descent. So we've dug through geography, we've looked at archaeology, we've even gotten into some ancient linguistics. So what's the final verdict on these exiled ancestors of Jesus? Let's pull all our evidence together. Let's just do a quick recap of what we figured out. First, this whole story is set in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. Second, Shealtiel and Zerubbabel were imperial subjects who had actual legal rights. They were not slaves. Third, they were part of a dethroned household, which means they were royal by blood but had no political power. And finally, and this is so cool, real archaeology, those ancient tablets, directly backs up the biblical story. And all of this leads to a really profound idea. It kind of shifts our whole perspective on what this royal line is all about. The Messiah's family tree doesn't just pass through powerful kings on golden thrones. It runs straight through princes who were born in exile, men whose royalty was kept alive not by armies or power, but by their legal status inside a foreign empire. They were sustained by their captors, preserved without any power, and eventually restored, but without a physical crown. What does it mean for a king's heritage to be defined by powerlessness? Now that's someone to think about.